Today's news is completely full of the story about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and US President Biden's statement, very much defending the decision to pull out from Afghanistan. And I thought that statement was exceedingly interesting. And the reason why is because President Biden was very much articulating the idea that, in his opinion, the US has gone significantly past what negotiators would call a breakpoint. And I thought this is a really good opportunity to explore that, to understand what is a breakpoint, to explain it, and to explain the consequences for not adhering to any breakpoints. So I don't want to get into any discussion about the merits of the US invasion and subsequent withdrawal from Afghanistan and the 20 long years in between. I just want to focus on this concept of a breakpoint. So first, I'm going to explain what a breakpoint is in negotiation terms. This is essentially, in any negotiation, where you set what I like to call a red line. So to give a really simple example, if you were in a price negotiation with someone, and let's say you bought something, a goods, for £1,000, you may set your breakpoint at £1,000 or £1,100. That is the point at which you will not sell below. And understandably, you won't sell below £1,000 because it costs you £1,000, and you want to make a bit of money. So you might set the true figure that your breakpoint, maybe a little bit higher, but not much higher. So you enter into negotiations with someone who's interested in buying what you're selling, and if they're not going to offer above £1,000, that sale is simply not going to go ahead. You are not going to compromise on that breakpoint. Now, of course, if they make an initial offer well above £1,000, then you will negotiate with them past that, because of course you want to get a bit of advantage. You want to get the best price possible. But essentially, the fact that they've offered above £1,000 above your breakpoint means that that sale is very likely to go ahead unless someone else jumps in and makes a better offer. So that's a very simplistic explanation of what is a negotiation breakpoint. Now, the key thing to emphasize here is that when you're doing big negotiations, big project negotiations, big programs, articulating your breakpoint or what your red lines are is not so easy. And it's crucial to understand this. You haven't usually got a price thing, a number you can focus on. You've normally got a whole range of factors. So what is crucial when you're preparing for negotiation, and do bear in mind that preparation for a big negotiation is at least 80 to 90% of the work. But when you're preparing for a negotiation, one of the key things you establish is what are your red lines. And this can be on a whole host of factors. It could be the quality standard, it could be the cost, the price, it could be regulatory standards, it could be certain legal or technical assurances, anything else that you consider utterly essential that you cannot do without. And this is the key thing to remember. This is not a luxury, this is not something you would like to have. This is something that is essential. Your red lines, your breakpoints are what are essential to you. And for any negotiation to succeed, the other side must understand those breakpoints and understand that you cannot compromise on them. So you have to be very credible when you establish your red lines and your breakpoints. And one of the mistakes some people may make is trying to pretend, oh no, we cannot go below, a certain price, for example, and then actually you get haggled below that price anyway. It wasn't a genuine red line. Don't do that ever. It's always a big mistake. It completely undermines your credibility. So perhaps going back to negotiation preparation, a lot of what you will do is you will deal with your technical experts, you will deal with your key stakeholders, and you will try and establish what those red lines are. And then you also establish what it is you want above the red line. No one wants just the red lines. Maybe if it's a legal requirement, sure, it's a binary thing, yes or no, are you compliant with it? But for most things, you want to go above, but there's a line that you will not go below. So that is essentially what a negotiation breakpoint is. Now, coming back to the Afghanistan news, one thing that's always been obvious in many ways is that the US had never really set a breakpoint in Afghanistan. And back in the day, many years ago, the US used to have this thing called the Powell Doctrine. The former Chief of Defense Staff, Sir Colin Powell, who served under Bush, and he set out this doctrine, which, ironically enough, he did not stick to when going to war in Iraq, but that's a different story. But he set out the doctrine that any military intervention should always be limited, should be specified, should achieve the objectives, and then should get out. So, in a sort of principled way, he set out what is a breakpoint, that you should establish your breakpoint. And it's quite clear in many ways that the US didn't do that in Afghanistan. And that's similar to a negotiation, not that I'm saying that Afghanistan is any kind of negotiation, but there are parallels we can draw. If you enter into a negotiation and you haven't set a breakpoint, you just got a bit of a ambiguous, a vague objective, one of the perils in that sort of negotiation that you can find yourself with a very open-ended commitment. You can find yourself constantly negotiating. You could even find yourself having concluded negotiations and signed up to the agreement, but because you haven't protected your red line, you haven't established your breakpoint, then actually, and you haven't secured buy-in with your stakeholders, and that's crucial. You must always have buy-in to your stakeholders. And if you don't have those things, then even after you sign the agreement, you're going to have lots of problems in whatever program, whatever project it is you've negotiated, because you will end up in this almost constant bickering of, are we getting what we want from this deal? Are we achieving the objectives that are important to us? And so on and so forth. And so you can look at this whole Afghanistan example as a big obvious example of that failure, of that fact that not only were no breakpoints set, but no one could agree on it. So fast forward to the current news, and Biden has stepped forward and he has said, I have made this decision that this stops. This stops now. The US had gone well past what he considers to have been the point that the US should have pulled out of Afghanistan. So he basically said, if you use a bit of negotiation terminology, you've gone well past the point you should have quit. And that's the argument he had made. But part of why the problem he's got at the moment and so much backlash is because he hasn't got universal agreement on that. And that's not Biden's fault. That is perhaps something that can go back many years, right to the very beginning of this conflict, is that there wasn't a unified agreement on what the outcome should have looked like. And this is a very similar concept in negotiations. You've got to have a unified agreement with your stakeholders, with the partners you're negotiating with, and what a good outcome looks like. Because without that, you end up, in many ways, just fighting your own side. You just will not agree, and they will not be happy with any decisions that you take, even if it is that you've legitimately established that you crossed the red line and you need to withdraw from that negotiation or that agreement. And that's the position that Biden is finding himself in now, and that's why he has taken the stand that he has. There's a final point I'd like to make in this, and that is it's also well reported that President Trump, or ex-President Trump, did negotiate an agreement with the Taliban in Doha in February 2020. And that is important, I think, as well, because on the international circuit, all countries rely on being credible. When you sign to an agreement, you do so in good faith. And the other side signs that agreement on the understanding that any commitments you have made, you will adhere to. So in this particular scenario, we have an agreement where both the US and Taliban, who are not what you might call allies, and certainly not friends, but they have made an agreement. And their credibility with each other, and possibly even with the international community, certainly in the Taliban's case, rests on the visible adherence to that agreement. And that is important. That is credibility. And I raise that as an important final point because the US's credibility for signing up to agreements was very seriously undermined, especially in the Middle Eastern world, when ex-President Trump pulled out of the Iran agreement over nuclear. Now, you can discuss the merits of what he did, whether it was the right decision or not. But what is very much true is that by reneging on that agreement, the US has fundamentally undermined its credibility, certainly with Iran, the ability to make future agreements, but also possibly with Iran's neighbours, other countries who might be closer allies to the US. They will have looked at that as the US cannot be trusted. So in many ways, what Biden has done is two things. He set a marker in the sand, if you like, a red line, and said we've crossed it, we're pulling out, we're withdrawing. And he's also attempted to establish credibility. The US will make agreements, will stick to it, and will comply with what it has agreed with the other side. So this is a complicated situation, and I can't pretend to fully understand it or be an expert on it. But I hope this little example, a very visible example, helps to really explain the critical importance of having red lines, understanding your red lines, and sticking to them. And that is a common mistake made in many negotiations.